Hi everyone, you're welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to look at the sources of energy for muscle contraction. So we've come to appreciate the fact that ATP is very essential for muscles to contract. We don't want to overemphasize the fact that you need calcium ions. In the absence of calcium ion, and for that matter, electrical excitation, even the presence of ATP will not cause a muscle to contract. That notwithstanding, ATP is very essential because remember that ATP has to be hydrolyzed into ADP before the myosin head will gain affinity to bind to the active binding sites on the actin. So what are the sources of getting ATP for all these muscular activities that happens within the body? Alright, the first source of ATP for muscle contraction is creatine phosphate, and I'll indicate it over here. So you have creatine phosphate over here, which would cause ATP to be produced. But how does that occur? Now take note that you have creatine inside the human body or inside the muscle, and this creatine is able to quickly convert ADP back to ATP. So the purpose of creatine is to add a phosphate group, or is to add a phosphate. The best way to put this is to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. So the presence of creatine phosphate, for that matter, creatine is able to repackage ADP into ATP, and that ATP can now be involved in muscle contraction. So that's the first source. Now this source is quite rapid, but it is depleted as much as it is produced. So muscles that depend on creatine phosphate always would fatigue easily. Now the second source of ATP is from the glycolytic pathway. And there are two ways. The first one is the fact that there is a fast and there is a slow glycolysis. The fast glycolysis obviously should happen in the presence or in the absence of oxygen. In this case, glucose that is converted to glycogen stored within the liver and for that matter released would undergo the glycolytic pathway in the absence of oxygen. So in the absence of oxygen, there will be pyruvate and an ATP that is produced. The ATP would be involved in muscle contraction, whereas the pyruvate will be converted into lactic acid in the absence of oxygen. In the presence of oxygen, then the oxygen that is present would cause this process to enter into the Krebs cycle instead of the glycolytic pathway. So the Krebs cycle becomes a slow process, which will still lead to the generation of ATP, but it is quite slow. So in the same vein, for the muscles that depend on anaerobic glycolysis to generate ATP, using glycogen also will fatigue easily because of the absence of oxygen. Now the last step over here is the use of oxygen. In this case, cellular respiration. So you are expecting that oxygen should be available for this process to take place. But then it's not only oxygen, the body can also depend on fatty acids. So fatty acids and then oxygen are both processes that could generate ATP through the oxidative phosphorylative pathway. And muscles that depend on this kind of ATP for their activity will not fatigue easily. But then they don't generate the ATP faster. So usually those muscles are for long metabolic activities like a race or an athlete going for a long race or marathon race. Some of the muscles that are going to sustain the marathon race or the athlete for going long is energy source or ATP source from cellular respiration. And as long as you're able to breathe in and out, you are getting oxygen and carbon dioxide to and fro. And so that oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP will be generated. So these are the three sources of ATP: from creatine phosphate, from glycolysis, and then oxidative phosphorylation or through cellular respiration. At the end of the day, we have ATP abundant inside the human body, ready for muscles to continually contract and relax. Take note that you need ATP for muscles to contract. You also need ATP for muscles to relax. However, the precursor to all of these is for calcium ions to be released. In the presence of calcium ions, muscle contraction will take place. In the absence of calcium ions, muscle relaxation will take place. Alright, so this brings us to the end of this video. I hope you have learned something new. All right, then, thank you and see you in the next video.